Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most confusing stories about human hygiene. A medieval merchant who soaked in his own family's used bath water and called it medicine, like a chef who sets his kitchen on fire to cook the steak faster, then wonders why the health inspector shows up. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you? I always love seeing who's out there in the dark with me. Honestly, it's the best part of this whole thing. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people think of medieval bathing, one image usually marches straight into their minds. A filthy peasant in a muddy lane, scratching his fleas, smelling like a stable, while his family is thinking, "Why doesn't he just jump in the river?" According to popular culture, medieval Europeans were essentially action figures without movable joints. They stood there, dirty and stiff, waiting for the Renaissance to wash them. They never bathed unless you count the time they fell into a puddle. They smelled terrible, but everyone smelled terrible, so it canceled out. And they apparently spent every waking moment breeding plague, because thinking is hard and they had stereotypes for that. The reality, as usual, is far less cinematic and considerably more human. And honestly, it's way weirder than anything Hollywood ever made up. Because this isn't a story about dirty peasants. It's about a world where bathing was a medical procedure, where you soaked in someone else's used water to cure your fever, and where the church banned baths because they led to sin. The same water that saved your soul could also kill you, and nobody could agree which was which. Let's start in a small stone room in the year 1250, when a man stepped into a wooden tub of hot water, and he was not trying to remove dirt from his skin. A man in the year 1250 who stepped into a wooden tub of hot water was not trying to remove dirt from his skin. That thought would have seemed almost silly to him. The dirt was there, yes, but it was his dirt, the dried sweat of his own labor, harmless as his own breath. What he wanted was to open the pores of his body and let the bad humors escape, like steam rising from a pot that had been boiling too long. And if the water in that tub had been used already by his wife, and his mother-in-law before her, and a neighbor before that, he would not have cared. The filth of others floating on the surface did not disgust him. What disgusted him was the invisible, the vapors that could settle in his lungs and curdle his blood, the evil air that crept through keyholes and under doors. The bath was a medical instrument, not a moral one. When I first stumbled upon this way of thinking, I was struck by how foreign it felt. We live in an age where bathing is tangled up with virtue. The clean person is the good person, the disciplined person, the person who has mastered their own body. But step back just a few centuries and that entire equation flips. To bathe too often in the Middle Ages was to risk being called vain or worse, lecherous. A 14th-century French chronicle records a noblewoman who bathed 3 times a week, and the chronicler mentions it not as a point of pride, but as a whisper of scandal. Something was wrong with her, something immoderate in her humors or her appetites. The same chronicler, puzzlingly, records with approval that the woman's husband bathed only once a month. The double standard ran deep, and it ran on a logic that had nothing to do with hygiene. The Romans, of course, had been an exception. The great bathhouses of the empire were not places for healing so much as stages for social performance, and their scale still astounds anyone who visits the ruins. Caracalla's bath complex could hold 1,600 bathers at once. 1,600 bodies, naked and steaming, moving through rooms of calibrated temperatures. The frigidarium cold enough to shock the breath from your lungs. The tepidarium warm as a summer evening. The caldarium so hot your skin turned pink within minutes. And in every room the transaction of status. Who walked where, who was served first, whose slaves waited by the pool with oil and strigils scraping the sweat and grime from their master's skin. The bath was a mirror of the city, reflected in water. But what did the Romans believe they were doing in those baths? They did not think they were washing off bacteria which they did not know existed. They thought they were maintaining the balance of their humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and that balance was health itself. The Roman physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century, prescribed baths the way a modern doctor prescribes antibiotics, specific temperatures for specific ailments, specific durations for specific constitutions. A cold bath for a man with too much yellow bile, a hot bath for a woman whose phlegm had thickened. The bath was not a luxury. It was a technology of the body, as precise as any medieval bloodletting. And then the empire fell and the great bathhouses crumbled, and for centuries historians assumed that Europe fell into a state of filth from which it only emerged in the 19th century with the discovery of germs. But this is one of those stories that sounds so neat in the telling that you should immediately be suspicious of it. The truth is stranger and more interesting. Bathing did not disappear. It transformed. A 1275 English estate account from the manor of Cuxham records the purchase of a wooden tub for the lord's personal use, alongside the cost of heating the water and the wages of a servant whose job was to fill and empty it. The lord was not bathing for cleanliness. The account also lists payments for laundry, which was handled separately, and for the purchase of scented herbs to throw into the water. The herbs were not perfumes in our sense. They were medicines. Rosemary for the head, lavender for the nerves, sage for the digestion. The bath was a pharmacy, and if you were not a lord but a common villager, you might never bathe in a tub at all. You would go to the stream or the river or the public bathhouse if your town had one, and many did. Medieval cities were full of bathhouses, often called stews, a word that would later come to mean something else entirely. The stews were places of steam and hot water, but also of assignation and gossip and commerce. A woman who ran a bathhouse in 14th century London might also be accused of running a brothel, and sometimes the accusation was accurate. The moralists of the church thundered against the bathhouses for precisely this reason, not because bathing was sinful in itself, but because naked bodies in warm water had a way of forgetting themselves. I find myself genuinely uncertain at this point about where to place my own judgment. On the one hand, the medieval church's suspicion of frequent bathing seems prudish and controlling. On the other hand, the church had a point about the bathhouses. They were not innocent. The line between a medicinal bath and an erotic encounter was thin and often deliberately blurred. A German manuscript from around 1480 shows a bathhouse scene that is explicitly sexual. with couples in the tubs touching each other while a servant pours more hot water and a musician plays in the corner. Was this a bath or a brothel? The answer is yes. And the church, whatever its motives, was not entirely wrong to be worried about what happened when bodies gathered in warm water with the lights low and the steam rising. To the medieval mind, the body was not a sealed container but a permeable vessel, constantly exchanging vapors and fluids with the world around it. The skin was not a barrier but a sieve. This is a hard concept for us to grasp, living as we do in an age of antibacterial soap and sealed packaging. We think of dirt as something that lands on the body from outside and must be removed. They thought of sickness as something that rose from inside the body and had to be coaxed out. And water could do the coaxing, or it could do the opposite. It could push sickness deeper, or let evil vapors in. So the decision to bathe was a calculated risk. The Benedictine monks, who were among the most educated people in Europe, had a complex relationship with bathing. The rule of Saint Benedict mentions bathing only briefly, permitting it for the sick but discouraging it for the healthy and monastic. Orders spent centuries arguing over how often a monk should wash. Some monasteries allowed bathing twice a year, before Christmas and before Easter, and these baths were communal, with the monks sitting in a large wooden tub in order of seniority, the water growing murkier with each body. Other monasteries banned bathing entirely for long stretches, considering it a distraction from the spiritual life. And yet the same monasteries often had elaborate systems for washing hands before meals, and for washing the feet of visitors, and for cleaning the dishes and linens. The prohibition was not against cleanliness in general. It was against the bath as a pleasurable immersion of the whole body. That was the indulgence, the luxury, the sin. When I first read the debates among medieval monks about whether a brother could bathe after bloodletting, the standard medical procedure of the time, I was struck by the sheer strangeness of the logic. The monks argued that bloodletting opened the body, and that a bath after bloodletting might let dangerous vapors in through the same openings that had just released bad humors. So the bath was postponed, sometimes for days, leaving the monk weak and dizzy and unwashed. To me, this sounds like the opposite of healing, but to them it was prudence. The body was a battlefield, and water was a weapon that could be used by either side. I have to remind myself every time I read these texts that these were not stupid people. They were operating on a different model of reality, one that had its own internal consistency, its own elegance. The humoral system could explain almost everything. Why you got sick, why you recovered, why some people were cheerful and others melancholic, why a hot bath on a cold day might save your life or end it. It was wrong, but it was not foolish. And here is where I find myself doubting my own argument. I have been telling you that pre-modern bathing was rational, that it followed from a coherent medical theory, that we should not sneer at people who soaked in each other's dirty water while herbs floated on the surface. But I cannot pretend that it worked. The humoral theory did not prevent the great plagues. It did not stop children from dying in their first year. It did not make anyone healthier in any measurable sense. And the bathing practices that followed from it, the shared tubs, the reused water, the long soaking sessions in public houses where disease traveled as easily as gossip, may have done more harm than good. The medieval bather was not a fool. But he was not saving his own life either. He was performing a ritual of health that had no effect on his actual health, and the comfort it gave him was the comfort of doing something rather than nothing. This is the part of history that unsettles me most. The realization that most of what people believed about their own bodies was wrong, and that they had no way of knowing it. And if you are listening to this in the dark with your eyes closed and your own skin warm against the sheets, you might ask yourself what future generations will say about you. The soap you use, the shower you take every morning, the deodorant you apply with the confidence of a Galenic physician. What will they make of it 500 years from now? They will not think you were foolish. They will think you did what you could with what you had. And they will be right, and they will be wrong, just as you are about the medieval bather. Let me take you inside one of those baths just once so you can feel what I mean. The room is small and low-ceilinged, built of stone that sweats with condensation. In the center sits a wooden tub large enough for 2 people, though tonight only one man occupies it, a merchant of middling wealth, his skin pink and wrinkled from an hour in the water. The fire beneath the tub has burned low, and the servant who tended it has fallen asleep in the corner, her head lolling against the wall. The only light comes from a single tallow candle guttering on a shelf, and the shadows it casts are huge and unsteady. The merchant's eyes are closed. He is not thinking about humors. He is not thinking about vapors or medicine or the state of his soul. He is thinking, perhaps, about nothing at all. The warmth has seeped into his bones and the silence has settled around him like a blanket, and for this moment, this single unguarded moment, he is simply a body in water at rest with no one watching. But outside that room, the world was changing. In the cities, the public bathhouses were flourishing. By the 13th century, Paris had more than 30 of them and London nearly as many. They were licensed by the city, inspected by officials, and frequented by everyone from bishops to bakers. A man could bathe for a few pennies, and if he wanted company, he could pay for a woman to wash his back, or to do more than wash his back, and the city authorities pretended not to notice. The bathhouse was a liminal space, neither fully public nor fully private, where the usual rules of behavior were suspended. You could be naked among strangers and it meant nothing. You could touch someone in the water and it meant everything. And yet the very popularity of the bathhouses carried the seed of their destruction. The moralists who had always distrusted them grew louder as the centuries passed. Preachers warned that the steam of the bathhouse carried sin as surely as it carried water vapor. City ordinances grew stricter, limiting the hours of operation, requiring separation between men and women, banning the practice of sharing beds in the bathhouse chambers. The authorities were fighting a losing battle, and they knew it. The bathhouse was too pleasurable, too intimate, too human to be regulated out of existence. But something else was coming that would succeed where the preachers and the ordinances had failed. Something that entered the body through the skin and the breath and the blood, that turned the bath itself into a portal of death. Let me stay with the merchant in his tub a moment longer. The candle flickers. The servant shifts in her sleep. The water cools around his body and he stirs and he opens his eyes and he calls for more hot water. It is the year 1347. The first ships are docking in Sicily, their crews dying of a sickness no one has ever seen. Within 3 years, the world he knows will be gone. And the baths, the warm, crowded, steaming baths where bodies press against bodies and vapors mingle and the invisible moves from person to person, will become places of such terror that no one will enter them for generations. But he does not know this yet. He only knows that the water is lukewarm and he wants it hot, and the servant is slow, and tomorrow he has a shipment of cloth to inspect, and life is ordinary and the silence is deep and he is warm. The merchant never did get his hot water that night. The servant slept on and the fire died, and by the time the first gray light touched the window he was shivering in a tub gone cold, his skin goose-pimpled and his mood black. He dressed without speaking, kicked the empty bucket by the door, and went out into a morning that smelled of rain and distant salt. He would remember that cold bath, I suspect, for the rest of his life, not because it mattered, but because it was the last ordinary discomfort he would ever feel. Within a year, everything he knew about his body, about sickness, about the water itself, had been turned inside out like a wet sleeve. The plague that arrived in Sicily in October of 1347 did not come as a surprise exactly. Europe had been expecting something for years: famines, wars, a creeping sense that the world was sliding toward some catastrophe. But no one had expected this. The ships that docked at Messina carried crews so ill that they could not stand, their bodies swollen with buboes the size of eggs, their skin mottled with dark patches that looked like bruises but were not bruises. The authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The rats had come ashore, and the fleas had found new hosts, and within weeks the plague was moving north through Italy like a shadow across a field. And the baths, the warm, crowded, intimate baths where the medieval body had gone to be healed and soothed and pleasured, became something else entirely. They became sites of terror. The moralists who had long warned against the bathhouses as dens of sin now had empirical proof, or what they believed was empirical proof, that the bath was a doorway to death. It was not an unreasonable conclusion. In the cramped, steam-filled rooms where dozens of people soaked together, the disease spread with a speed that seemed supernatural. One day you bathed next to a healthy man. The next day he was dead. The day after that you were dead too. The link between the bath and the plague was obvious, even if the mechanism was invisible. What the medieval observer did not know, could not know, was that the real vectors were fleas and rats, not the water itself. But the water took the blame, and that blame would reshape the way Europeans thought about washing for half a millennium. I have no definitive answer for why the bathhouse became such a powerful symbol of plague contagion when the church itself was equally crowded and probably just as dangerous. I have guesses, only guesses. Perhaps it was the nakedness. In the bathhouse, the body was exposed, its swellings, its skin discolorations, its fevers, and that exposure made the danger visible in a way that the clothed congregation in a cathedral aisle was not. Perhaps it was the water itself, which carried the dead skin and sweat of the sick and seemed to pass their essence directly into the pores of the healthy. Or perhaps it was simply that the bathhouse had always been suspect, and the plague gave the suspicion a justification that no one could argue with. Whatever the reason, the bathhouses closed. City after city shut them down. The ordinances that had once regulated them now banned them outright. In Paris, the great stews that had served nobles and commoners alike were boarded up. In London, The Southwark bathhouses became ghost buildings, their tubs dry, their fires cold. But here is the contradiction that I cannot stop turning over in my mind. The same people who fled the bathhouses did not flee the church. They packed into cathedrals and knelt in packed chapels and pressed their lips to relics that had been touched by thousands of other pilgrims. They went on crusades and into battles, and to markets where the crowd was so thick you could not move your elbows. They did not understand that proximity itself was the danger. They understood only that the bathhouse was dangerous because it was wet and warm and naked, and the church was safe because it was dry and clothed and holy. The logic was wrong, but it was consistent with their worldview. The bath had always been a place where the boundaries of the body dissolved, where the inside and the outside mixed. What the plague did was make that dissolution visible and terrifying and permanent. If you are listening to this in the quiet of your own room, with your skin clean and your sheets fresh, I want you to imagine what it means to lose the ability to safely immerse yourself in warm water. Not to choose cold showers for ideological reasons, that comes later, but to genuinely believe that stepping into a tub will kill you. To watch your neighbors die after a visit to the bathhouse. To hear the church declare that the steam itself carries death. To walk past the boarded-up doors of the stews and smell, still, the faint damp of abandoned water. This was the world that emerged from the plague years, and it persisted in various forms for centuries. The great irony, of course, is that the plague did not spread through the water. The fleas that carried Yersinia pestis from rats to humans did not need a bathhouse to do their work. They could bite you in your bed, at your table, in the street. But the medieval mind, desperate for a cause that made sense within its own system, latched onto the bath. And the result was a transformation in the very concept of personal care. A 1375 medical treatise from Montpellier, written by a physician who had lived through the plague, advised its readers to avoid bathing altogether. "The bath opens the pores," the physician wrote, "and through the open pores enters the corrupted air that brings the pestilence." This was not superstition to him. It was observation, filtered through the humoral theory he had studied for decades. He had seen people die after bathing. He had seen them die after not bathing. But those deaths did not fit the pattern. The pattern told him that the open pore was a wound, and the bath was the knife that made it. When I first read that Montpellier treatise, I felt a kind of vertigo. The physician was not stupid. He was careful, systematic, observant. He had watched the plague eat through his city and had tried to find a pattern in the carnage. And he found one, the wrong one, but one that made sense inside his framework. He could not have found the right one. The tools did not exist. The microscope was 3 centuries away. The germ theory of disease was 5 centuries away. He was doing the best he could with what he had, and what he had was Galen and his own eyes and the memory of all those dying in their tubs. And the consequence of his best effort was that bathing became, for millions of people, a thing to be feared. The shared motif of rust appears here, if I may let it. The great metal cauldrons that hung over the fires of the public bathhouses did not rust overnight. They corroded slowly, the brown stain creeping outward from the rivets, and no one noticed until the rust had eaten through and the cauldron leaked and had to be patched. That is how the bathing culture of Europe corroded too. Not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow disintegration that no one noticed until the water was gone. The bathhouses closed, one by one, and the memory of them faded. The rituals that had surrounded bathing, the herbs, the steam, the conversation, the touch, were forgotten or transformed into something else. The word stew lost its connection to hot water and became a word for a brothel, and then for a meat dish, and the original meaning drifted away like steam from a forgotten room. But the story does not end there because humans are creatures of water. We are born in water. Our bodies are mostly water. We cannot stop wanting to be in it, even when we are afraid of it. So the bathing that did not disappear went underground, literally and figuratively. The wealthy continued to bathe, but privately in locked rooms with servants who were sworn to silence. The nobility of the 15th century had their wooden tubs brought into their bedchambers, hidden behind screens, filled with water that had been boiled and scented and tested for temperature by a servant who risked punishment if it was too hot or too cold. The bath became a secret indulgence, a thing done behind closed doors, a pleasure that was slightly shameful. A French noblewoman of the 1430s wrote in her diary, a rare survival, now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, that she bathed in secret. With only my maid to attend, and I felt as if I were committing a sin, yet I could not stop. She did not describe the sin. She did not need to. The word bath had taken on a charge that was half medical, half erotic, half religious. It was a thing that healed and corrupted at the same time. And the poor did not have private chambers. The poor did not have servants to haul water. The poor bathed in rivers and streams in the cold outdoors under the eyes of anyone who passed by. And they bathed less often, not because they were more afraid of the plague, though they were afraid, but because bathing required resources they did not have. Fuel for heating water was expensive. Tubs were expensive. Time was expensive. A peasant who worked from dawn to dusk did not have an hour to sit in a tub, even if he had the tub and the fuel and the water. So the class divide that had always existed in bathing grew wider. The rich bathed in secret with guilt and pleasure. The poor bathed in public with cold and haste. And the middle, the merchants, the artisans, the clerks, bathed sometimes when they could afford it, when the plague seemed far away, when the church's warnings felt less urgent than the simple human need to be warm and wet and still. I told you in the first chapter that I found myself doubting my own argument, and I find myself doubting it again now. I have been describing the decline of bathing as a tragedy, a loss of something precious, a cultural wound that took centuries to heal. But I cannot ignore the fact that the people who stopped bathing did not die of filth. They did not die of dirt. They died of plague, which was not caused by dirt, and they died of other diseases that were not helped or hindered by how often they washed. The pre-modern body was not cleaner or dirtier than our own in any meaningful sense. It was simply different. The absence of regular bathing did not make people sicker, and the presence of it did not make them healthier. The whole framework we use to talk about hygiene is anachronistic when applied to the centuries before germ theory. We are judging them by standards they could not have imagined, and that judgment is unfair. And yet I cannot shake the image of that French noblewoman hiding behind her screen, washing her body in water that had to be boiled and carried and poured, feeling as if she were doing something forbidden. She was not afraid of germs. She was afraid of God and of her neighbors and of the memory of the plague that had taken her mother and her sister and her first child. She was afraid that the bath itself, that ancient technology of healing, had betrayed her. And she was right, in a way. The bath had betrayed her, not because it carried death, but because it carried her own desire, her own body, her own need to be touched by warmth. And that desire felt like a sin in a world that had learned to mistrust the very idea of pleasure. Let me take you to the banks of the Seine, a century later on a summer evening in the 1540s. A young man, a student perhaps, or a clerk, stands at the water's edge, watching the sunset turn the river the color of old copper. He is hot. He has been walking all day. His clothes are stuck to his skin. He can smell himself, and he does not like it. Behind him in the city, the streets are full of people who smell the same way. It is a smell that does not bother them most of the time because everyone carries it. But on a hot evening it can become overwhelming, a blanket of sweat and garlic and fish and sewage. The young man looks at the water. He knows that the river is full of everything, runoff from the tanneries, waste from the houses, the carcasses of animals. He also knows that people swim in it anyway, that he has seen them, that he has done it himself when he was younger and less cautious. The memory of the plague is still alive in the city's stories, but the plague itself has not returned in decades, and the fear has softened into something like a habit, a thing you remember but do not feel. He takes off his shoes. He unties his collar. He steps into the water and the cold shocks him and he gasps, and then he keeps walking until the water reaches his chest, and then he lets himself fall forward into the current. The river takes him, and for a moment he is not a clerk or a scholar or a sinner. He is only a body in water, weightless and free, and the city behind him has vanished into the dusk. He does not know that he is part of a slow return, a long, reluctant reacquaintance with the element that his ancestors had abandoned in terror. He does not know that the river is teaching him something that the physicians and the preachers have forgotten. That water, even dirty water, even dangerous water, is still the place where the human body feels most like itself. He only knows that he is cold, and he is wet, and he is happy, and far away in a city he has never seen a physician. Is sharpening his tools and preparing to cut open a human body and find, hidden in its fluids, the first clues to a secret that will bring the baths back to Europe for good. The river took him, and the river brought him back. The young clerk who swam in the Seine that summer evening did not become a footnote in the history of hygiene because no one recorded his name. But his kind multiplied across Europe in the century that followed. The slow return to water was not a revolution. It was a series of small, uncoordinated acts of defiance against a fear that had begun to lose its grip. The plague did not return to Western Europe with the same ferocity after the 17th century, and the memory of the Great Dying became a story rather than a present terror. And as the fear receded, the baths crept back into ordinary life, not the great public stews of the medieval city, but something more contained, more private, more medical. The physician that the young clerk could not see, sharpening his tools in a distant city, was not a single man but a profession. Across the 16th and 17th centuries, the study of anatomy transformed the European understanding of the body. Andreas Vesalius, in 1543, published his De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a book whose illustrations of the dissected human form were so precise, so beautiful, that they changed the way physicians thought about what lay under the skin. And what lay under the skin, it turned out, was not a simple container for humors. It was a complex machine of bones and muscles and organs and fluids, each part connected to every other part by channels that the ancients had only guessed at. The humoral theory did not die overnight, but it began to crack. If the body was a machine, then it could be cleaned like a machine. If the pores were not just openings for vapors but conduits for sweat and oil and salt, then perhaps the bath was not a danger after all. Perhaps it was a tool for maintaining the machine. When I first read Vesalius, I was struck by how little he actually said about bathing. The great anatomist was interested in structure, not in hygiene. But the implications of his work were enormous. If the body was a machine, then the skin was its outer casing. And casings, as any craftsman knew, needed to be maintained. The metaphor of the machine slowly replaced the metaphor of the vessel, and with that replacement came a new permission to bathe. A 1602 English medical manual titled The Haven of Health advised its readers to bathe once a month, not for wantonness, but for the preservation of the body. The author, a physician named Thomas Coggan, was careful to distance himself from the medieval bathhouses. He recommended a private bath in a locked room with water that had been boiled and then cooled to a precise temperature. The bath was no longer a social pleasure. It was maintenance procedure, as private as a bowel movement. And yet the old suspicions lingered. A generation after Coggan, the English writer James I wrote a book called Basilican Doron in which he advised his son, the future Charles I, to bathe rarely, and only when the body was oppressed with sweat or dust. James was a notoriously dirty man, according to the French ambassador. The king never washed his hands, only wiped them on his clothes, and his advice came from a place of deep personal conviction. But the king's distaste for bathing was not simply a royal eccentricity. It was a position that had centuries of tradition behind it. The body, even in the age of anatomy, was still seen as dangerously permeable. The bath, even when private, threatened to soften the flesh and open the soul to temptation. The moralists had not vanished. They had simply retreated to the court and the pulpit, waiting for the moment when they could reassert their authority. And then something unexpected happened. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought with it a new interest in the Roman bath, not as a practical model, but as an ideal. Humanists read Pliny and Seneca and marveled at the scale and sophistication of Roman bathing culture. They wrote treatises on how the Romans had built their aqueducts and heated their floors and arranged their pools in order of temperature. And they asked, implicitly, why their own age could not do the same. The question was a dangerous one, because it implied that the medieval world had lost something that the ancients had possessed. And the implication, in turn, forced a reconsideration of the whole history of bathing. Had the medieval church been right to suppress the bathhouses? Or had it destroyed something beautiful and useful out of a misplaced suspicion of the body? A 1620 English pamphlet, The Benefit of the Ancient Baths at Bathe, made the argument explicitly. The author, a physician named Tobias Venner, claimed that the natural hot springs of the city of Bath, which had been used since Roman times and had never completely fallen out of use, were a gift from God, not a temptation of the devil. "The waters work by their heat and their minerals," he wrote, "and they cleanse the body of impurities that no medicine can reach." Venner was careful to distinguish the natural spring from the artificial bath. The spring was holy, a product of the earth's own chemistry. The artificial bath was man-made, suspicious, easily corrupted. This distinction was a clever rhetorical move. It allowed Venner to rehabilitate bathing without defending the stews. It also reflected a deeper shift in the European imagination. Water was no longer simply a carrier of vapors. It was a substance with its own properties, its own virtues, its own dangers. I have to admit, when I first read Venner's pamphlet, I was skeptical. The distinction between natural and artificial water seemed arbitrary, even superstitious. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood. Venner was not a scientist in the modern sense. He was a physician working within a framework that blended observation, tradition, and theology. The natural spring was holy because it had been created by God for the benefit of humankind. The artificial bath was suspect because it had been created by humans for human purposes which were often impure. This was not a medical argument. It was a moral argument dressed in medical language, and it worked. The spa towns of Europe, Bath, Baden-Baden, Karlovy Vary, Spa itself, began to attract visitors in numbers that had not been seen since the Roman era. The sick came to be healed. The wealthy came to be seen. The curious came to soak in water that bubbled up from the earth, warm and mineral and ancient. And they felt, as they lowered themselves into the stone pools, that they were participating in a tradition that connected them to the Romans and to the Greeks and to the very origins of civilization. But the spa was not the bathhouse. The spa was respectable. The bathhouse had been a place of steam and darkness and ambiguous touch. The spa was a place of daylight and stone architecture and medical supervision. A patient at Bath in the 1650s would be prescribed a specific number of minutes in the water, at a specific temperature, at a specific time of day. He would be observed by a physician who took notes. He would drink the water as well as soak in it, and the drinking was considered as important as the immersion. The whole experience was structured, controlled, medicalized. It was the opposite of the medieval stew, which had been chaotic, commercial, and unregulated. And yet the stew and the spa were both, in the end, places where human bodies covered in water touched each other and felt pleasure. The difference was not in the act. The difference was in the story that surrounded. The act. If you are listening to this, and you have ever sat in a hot spring and felt your muscles relax, you know something that the doctors of the 17th century were only beginning to formulate. The warmth of the water does not just clean you. It undoes you. It softens the boundaries between inside and outside, between self and other, between what you are and what you might become. The spa visitor who stepped into the King's Bath at Bath in 1660 was not the same person who stepped out. He had been changed by the water, not chemically, but spiritually. The mineral springs had a reputation for curing infertility, and many a childless couple made the pilgrimage, and many a child was conceived in the lodgings that surrounded the bath. And whether the conception was caused by the minerals or by the proximity of warm bodies in a place where pleasure was permitted, no one could say. The physicians attributed it to the water. The church wisely said nothing. The rust motif returns. The pipes that carried water from the hot springs to the bathhouses of Bath were made of lead. Over time, the lead corroded, and the rust that formed was not the red rust of iron, but the white powdery corrosion of lead oxide. The water that flowed through those pipes carried lead into the bodies of the bathers, and the lead accumulated in their bones and the chronic illnesses that plagued the spa's regular visitors. The fatigue, the joint pain, the cognitive fog were attributed to the treatment itself. No one knew. No one could have known. The water was supposed to heal, and it did heal sometimes, but it also poisoned. The human body, soaking in the warm mineral water, was receiving both the benefit and the harm, and the two were impossible to separate. That is always the way with bathing across all the centuries. The water gives and the water takes. The bath that cures a fever may also drown a child. The spa that restores a woman's fertility may also give her a slow lead poisoning that kills her a decade later. The story of bathing is the story of humans trying to make a bargain with the elements and losing as often as winning. Let me stay in Bath in the summer of 1685 and let the scene unfold. The King's Bath is a rectangle of stone, 50 feet long and 40 feet wide, surrounded by galleries where spectators can watch the bathers below. The water is a pale green, opaque, steaming gently in the cool morning air. A bell rings and the bathers descend the stone steps into the water. They are not naked. They are wrapped in linen shifts or canvas gowns, and the shifts float around their bodies as they sink, and the fabric clings to them wetly, and there is no erotic charge because there is no intention, at least not in the open. A physician stands at the edge of the bath, carrying a long stick with which he prods the bathers, testing the temperature of the water at different points, instructing them to move to the left or the right. The bathers obey. They float. They talk. They drink cups of water that are brought to them on trays that float on cork rafts. The conversation is about the weather, about politics, about the water itself. "I feel it in my bones," a woman says, and she means it literally. The heat is reaching into her joints, loosening the stiffness that has plagued her for years. She does not know about lead. She does not know about the invisible accumulation that will one day manifest as a tremor in her hands. She knows only that she is warm and that the warmth is a mercy, and that for this hour she is not in pain, and that perhaps is enough. But even as the spa culture flourished, another current was running underground. The medical justification for bathing, the idea that water could balance the humors, could cleanse the pores, could carry away the corrupted air, was losing its coherence. The humoral theory was dying slowly, replaced by something harder and more chemical. The discovery of the circulation of the blood by William Harvey in 1628 had already shaken the old framework. If the blood moved in a circle, then the humors could not simply pool in the tissues. They had to be in constant motion, produced and broken down by the body's own machinery. And if the body was a machine, then the bath was not a medical intervention at all. It was a comfort. It was a pleasure. It was a thing you did because you liked it. This was a terrifying thought for the physicians who had built their careers on the medical bath. If the bath was not medicinal, then what was it? A luxury? A sin? The old moral arguments came rushing back. The 18th century saw an explosion of literature about the dangers of bathing, not from plague this time, but from moral decay. A 1745 pamphlet titled The Danger of Bathing in Warm Water warned that the practice softened the fiber, relaxed the nerves, and inclined the mind to sensuality. The author was not a medieval monk. He was a London physician named George Cheyne, a man who had himself written about the benefits of bathing in earlier works. Cheyne had changed his mind, and his change of mind reflected a deeper unease in the culture. The Enlightenment was supposed to be the age of reason. But reason applied to the body produced contradictory results. Was the bath a cure, or a poison, a pleasure or a sin, a technology of health or a technology of vice? The answer depended on who you asked and when and what they had read that morning. To me, the most unsettling part of this history is the way the arguments circle back on themselves. The medieval physician feared the bath because it opened the pores to corrupted air. The 18th century physician feared it because it softened the fibers and relaxed the nerves. The arguments are different, but the underlying anxiety is the same. The bath makes the body vulnerable. It undoes the boundary between the self and the world. It reminds us that we are made of water, and that water has no respect for our categories of pure and impure, healthy and sick, holy and profane. We have been trying to control the meaning of the bath for 2,000 years. We have never succeeded. And that, perhaps, is why the real reason humans started bathing, the reason that existed before all the medical theories and moral panics, is the simplest one, because it feels good. Because the warmth of water on the skin is a pleasure that requires no justification. Because the human body, submerged, returns for a moment to the condition it knew before birth, floating in the dark, weightless, safe. All the rest, the humors, the hygiene, the germs, the sin, is story. We tell ourselves stories about why we bathe because the truth is too naked to face. We bathe because we want to. And when the stories change, the bathing changes too, but the wanting remains. A man in the year 1840 who stepped into a wooden tub of hot water was not thinking about humors. He had never heard of humors. He was thinking about the new pamphlet he had read by a doctor named John Snow, who argued that cholera was spread not by bad air but by contaminated water. The man had not fully understood the pamphlet. It was technical, full of statistics about the pumps of Soho. But he had understood the implication. His bath water, if it was not clean, could kill him. He boiled it now before he poured it into the tub. He had never done that before. He did not know why he had started. He only knew that the old certainty that the bath was safe, that the bath was healthy, that the bath was a simple pleasure, had been replaced by a new unease. The water was not his friend. The water was a test, and he did not know whether he was passing or failing. The man who boiled his bath water in 1840 was not a scientist. He was a clerk, or a shopkeeper, or perhaps a minor civil servant. He had read Dr. Snow's pamphlet on cholera and had not understood the statistics, but he had understood the fear. And the fear was contagious in a way that the cholera itself could not have been. It moved through the city faster than any bacterium, through conversations and newspapers and the anxious glances of neighbors. The water that had once been a comfort, a simple pleasure, a habit inherited from generations of bathers had become a question. Was it safe? Could it be trusted? and the question itself, once asked, could not be unasked. Jon Snow was the man who asked it most loudly, and he paid for his asking with a decade of ridicule. In 1854, when cholera broke out in the Soho district of London, Snow went from door to door with a map marking the deaths. He noticed that almost all the victims had drawn their water from the Broad Street pump. He convinced the parish authorities to remove the pump's handle, and the outbreak stopped. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but the medical establishment resisted. Cholera, they said, was caused by miasma, bad air, rising from the sewers and the graveyards. It could not be caused by water, because water was the medium of life, not of death. Snow was a crank, a nuisance, a man obsessed with a theory that contradicted everything the physicians had known since Hippocrates. When I first read Snow's map of the Broad Street outbreak, I found myself staring at it for a long time. It is a simple thing, a street map of Soho, with black bars stacked at each address to mark the number of cholera deaths. The pattern is unmistakable. The black bars cluster around Broad Street and fade to nothing as you move away. And right in the center, where the pump stood, there is a concentration of death so dense that the street itself seems to be bleeding ink. Snow did not know that the bacterium Vibrio cholerae was the cause. He died in 1858, before Robert Koch isolated the organism in 1883. But he knew that the water was the vector. He knew it the way a craftsman knows his tools, by observation and inference and the relentless accumulation of detail. He was right, and he was ignored, and the people of London continued to die of cholera for another 30 years because the theory of miasma was too beautiful to abandon. The beautiful theory. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The theory of miasma was elegant. It explained why the poor got sick more often than the rich, because the poor lived in low-lying areas where the air was thick with the stench of sewage and decay. It explained why summer was the season of disease, because the heat made the bad air rise. It explained why certain neighborhoods were afflicted year after year, because the geography of the city channeled the poisoned air through the same streets. And it even explained why bathing was dangerous, because water opened the pores and let the miasma enter. The theory was wrong, but it was not stupid. It was a work of the human mind trying to make sense of a world in which the causes of disease were invisible and the consequences were unbearable. And when Snow and Pasteur and Koch began to dismantle it, they were not just replacing one theory with another. They were breaking a worldview that had sustained the medical profession for 2,000 years. And the bath was at the center of the breaking, because if Snow was right, if water could carry disease, then the bath was not a therapeutic tool but a delivery system for poison. The medieval fear of the bath was suddenly justified, not by the old theory of vapors and humors, but by the new theory of germs. A generation of physicians who had grown up believing in the healing power of warm water had to confront the possibility that they had been poisoning their patients. The spa towns that had flourished on the promise of mineral cures were suddenly suspect. The water that bubbled up from the earth might carry not just minerals but bacteria, and the bacteria did not care whether the spa was natural or artificial, holy or profane. The bath was dangerous again, not because it opened the pores to miasma, but because it carried bacteria through the skin and the mouth and the eyes. The The same conclusion reached through opposite premises. The bath was a threat. The body must be protected from it. But this time the response was different. The moral panic of the plague years had driven people out of the baths and into a kind of resigned filth. The scientific panic of the 19th century drove people into a new relationship with water. If the bath could carry germs, then the bath must be purified. The water must be boiled. The tub must be scrubbed. The body must be washed with soap. Soap, which had been a luxury for centuries, became a necessity. And the washing itself, the act that had been suspect, became the opposite of suspect. It became a moral imperative. The clean body was the safe body. The dirty body was the dangerous body. And the class dynamics that had always haunted bathing, the rich who could afford privacy and the poor who could not, became even sharper. A 1850 report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population of Great Britain, written by Edwin Chadwick, described the living conditions of the urban poor in terms that were meant to shock the middle class into action. Chadwick wrote of families who shared a single room, a single bed, a single bucket of water. He wrote of children who had never felt warm water on their skin. He wrote of the smell, that terrible smell that clung to the tenements and the alleys and the bodies themselves. The smell that the middle class associated with moral decay as much as physical dirt. And here is the cruelty that I cannot stop thinking about. The poor were told that their filth was the cause of their suffering. They were told that if they would only wash, they would be healthy. They were told that the cholera and the typhus and the tuberculosis that killed their children were punishments for their own uncleanliness. And this was not entirely false. There was a real connection between dirt and disease, even if the connection was not what the moralists thought it was. But the poor were also told this by people who had access to clean water, who had bathtubs in their homes, who had servants to carry the water and heat it and dispose of it. The advice was true, but the advice was also a weapon. The bath became a tool of social discipline, a way of distinguishing the respectable from the degraded, the clean from the dirty, the worthy from the unworthy. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt ashamed of the state of your home or your body, you know something about this history. That shame did not come from nowhere. It was manufactured over decades by a culture that had decided that cleanliness was not just next to godliness. It was identical to it. The Victorian obsession with bathing was not a return to the Roman ideal of the bath as a social pleasure. It was a new invention, a moral technology, a way of telling people that their bodies were unacceptable unless they had been scrubbed and soaped and rinsed within an inch of their lives. The medieval peasant who bathed twice a year did not feel ashamed of his dirt. The Victorian factory worker who bathed once a week, if he was lucky, felt ashamed every day. The shame was the point. Let me take you to a tenement in Manchester in the winter of 1867. The room is cold. The water in the jug on the washstand has frozen overnight. A woman, she is 30 years old but looks 50, breaks the ice with the heel of her hand and pours the water into a basin. She strips to the waist and begins to wash using a rag that was once a child's dress. The water turns gray immediately. She does not have soap. Soap is expensive, and there are better uses for the money. She washes as much of herself as she can reach. Then she dresses again, and she pours the dirty water into the slop bucket, and she goes downstairs to start the fire. No one in that building has a bathtub. No one has ever had a bathtub. The idea of immersing the whole body in clean, hot water is as distant as the idea of flying. And yet the pamphlets and the preachers and the sanitary inspectors tell her that her children are dying because she is dirty. She knows that her children are dying because the water in the street is contaminated by the cesspool next door, because the landlord will not fix the roof, because the air in the room she shares with 6 other people is thick with coal smoke and the breath of the sick. But she washes anyway, with the cold gray water, and she feels the shame settle into her bones like a second skeleton. The bath in the 19th century became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world and everything that could fix it. The reformers believed that if they could build public bathhouses, clean, regulated, free, or cheap, they could transform the health and the morals of the poor. And so the bathhouses returned after an absence of centuries. But they were not the stews of the medieval city. They were not places of steam and conversation and ambiguous pleasure. They were institutions designed by architects and overseen by officials, with separate entrances for men and women, with schedules and prices and rules. A working man who visited a public bathhouse in London in 1870 did not lounge in warm water with his neighbors. He took a shower, a quick, efficient spray of water, cold or warm depending on his budget, and he was out in 15 minutes. The shower was the perfect technology for the age. Clean, fast, utilitarian, leaving no room for the sensual drift that had made the medieval bathhouse so dangerous. The shower was a moral instrument as much as a hygienic one. And yet the sensual drift could not be eliminated entirely. I have seen photographs of the Turkish baths that became fashionable in Victorian London, rooms of patterned tile and marble, with pools of warm water and benches where men in towels sat and talked. The Turkish bath was a Victorian invention, not an authentic import from the East, but it satisfied a hunger that the shower could not kill. The hunger for warmth, for slowness, for the feeling of water against skin in a room where time seemed to stop. The Victorians condemned the medieval stew as a den of vice, and then built their own version of it, called it a Turkish bath, and pretended it was something entirely different. The hypocrisy is almost touching. The human need for immersion in warm water is so strong that it will find its way around any prohibition, any moral system, any theory of disease. The rust motif finds its way back here, if I may. The iron pipes that carried water to the new public bathhouses corroded from the inside, slowly, invisibly, and the rust that flaked off into the water was not dangerous. Iron is not dangerous, but the corrosion that weakened the pipes was a kind of betrayal. The pipes were supposed to carry health. They carried water that had been filtered and heated and tested. But the pipes themselves were breaking down, and no one knew. The water that came out of the tap was clean. The water that had passed through the pipes was clean. But the pipes were not clean, and one day they would fail, and the bathhouse would flood, and the whole apparatus of reform would be revealed as a thing made by human hands, subject to human weakness. A man in the year 1900 who stepped into a bath, a proper bath, a full immersion bath, with hot water that had been heated by a boiler in the basement, was participating in a ritual that had been transformed by science, reformed by morality, and shaped by industrial technology. He did not think about humors. He did not think about miasma. He thought, if he thought about it at all, about germs, the invisible enemies that the new science of bacteriology had revealed. He thought about soap, which had been proven to kill bacteria. He thought about the temperature, which should be warm but not hot, because hot water damaged the skin and made it vulnerable to infection. He thought about the time, which should be no longer than 20 minutes, because prolonged immersion softened the skin and allowed bacteria to enter. The bath had become a procedure, a regimen, a series of correct steps to be followed. The pleasure was still there, but it was a permitted pleasure, a pleasure that had been approved by science and by society. The bath that had once been a portal to death had been tamed. The question was whether something had been lost in the taming. I wonder sometimes whether the Victorian bath reformers knew what they were destroying. The medieval bathhouse had been a place of community, of physical intimacy, of pleasure that was not justified by utility. The Victorian shower was a place of isolation, of speed, of purpose. The medieval bather had soaked in water that had been used by his neighbors, and he had not been disgusted. The Victorian bather could not bear to share a bathtub with his own wife, or rather, he could bear it, but the sanitary manuals told him that it was dangerous, and the danger made the pleasure impossible. Something was lost. Something about the acceptance of the body, the willingness to share the water, the old knowledge that the body's dirt was not a threat but a fact. And what was gained was also real, a dramatic reduction in the diseases that had killed children and adults for centuries. The trade was worth it, but it was still a trade, and the thing that was traded away cannot be recovered by taking a bath in a marble tub with a glass of wine and a scented candle. That is not a return to the medieval bath. It is a continuation of the Victorian one with better marketing. The young woman in Paris did not die of the bacteria in the cooling towers. She did not die of lead in the pipes, or of cholera in the water, or of the plague that her grandmother had survived as a child. She lived into her 80s, long enough to see the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable to her when she first lowered herself into that porcelain tub in 1900. She saw the invention of the domestic water heater, which meant that hot water could be summoned at any hour without a servant to carry it. She saw the mass production of soap, which turned a luxury into a commodity. She saw the rise of the bathroom as a standard room in every new house, with its gleaming white fixtures and its tiled floor and its medicine cabinet full of bottles that promised to make the body cleaner, healthier, more acceptable. And she saw, toward the end of her life, the first stirring doubt, a quiet suspicion that the world of cleanliness she had helped to build was not the paradise it had promised to be. The doubt came from many directions, and it came slowly, the way rust spreads along a pipe. The environmental movement of the 1960s pointed out that the water we used to clean ourselves was not infinite, that the chemicals we poured down the drains were poisoning the rivers, that the very act of bathing, the daily shower, the long soak in the tub, had an ecological cost that no one had counted. The feminist movement of the 1970s questioned the beauty standards that told women their bodies were unacceptable unless they were shaved and scented and moisturized. The alternative health movement of the 1980s and 1990s revived the ancient suspicion that bathing too often might actually be bad for you, that soap stripped the skin of its natural oils, that hot water weakened the immune system, that the bacteria on our skin were not enemies but allies. The doubt was not coherent. It was not a single argument. It was a collection of whispers, growing louder, pointing in different directions, but all of them asking the same question: had we gone too far? When I first read the works of the early 20th century hygienists, the men who designed the public baths of New York and London and Berlin, who wrote the manuals that taught millions of immigrants how to wash, I was struck by the confidence of their tone. They spoke as if they had solved the great problem of human health, as if the bath were a final invention, as if the only task that remained was to spread it to every corner of the world. They could not imagine that their grandchildren would look back at them with skepticism. They could not foresee that the daily shower, that monument to sanitary progress, would one day be criticized as a waste of water, a source of pollution, a neurotic compulsion. They were certain of their mission, and their certainty is, from where I sit now, both touching and terrifying. Touching because they genuinely believed they were saving lives, and they were terrifying because certainty of that kind has a way of blinding people to the costs of their own solutions. And the costs were real. The chlorination of public water supplies, which began in the early 20th century, virtually eliminated waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera. It was one of the greatest public health achievements in human history. But the chlorine reacted with organic matter in the water to produce byproducts that were later linked to cancer. The same water that saved millions from acute illness may have given thousands a chronic disease decades later. The trade was worth it, almost certainly. But the trade was real, and it was invisible, and the people who drank the chlorinated water and bathed in it and swam in it had no way of knowing what they were trading. The water giver and the water taker, still at their eternal game. If you are listening to this, and you have ever stood under a shower and felt the hot water beat against your shoulders, and you have wondered for a moment whether you really needed to do this, whether your body was actually dirty, or whether you were just following a script that had been written for you by a century of advertisers and reformers and well-meaning doctors, then you are part of the doubt I am describing. The doubt is not a rejection of cleanliness. It is a question about the meaning of cleanliness. It is the question that the medieval bather would have recognized immediately. What are you trying to accomplish when you wash? Are you removing germs? Are you opening your pores? Are you performing a ritual that signals your place in the social order? Are you simply satisfying a need that has no name? I have no answer to that question, and I suspect that the question itself is the point. The history of bathing is a history of answers that turned out to be wrong. The humoral answer was wrong. The miasma answer was wrong. The germ answer was right, but incomplete, and the incompleteness is becoming more obvious with every new study of the human microbiome, every new discovery that the bacteria on our skin are not invaders but partners. The medieval bather who shared his bathwater with his neighbors was not just following a bad medical theory. He was living in a world where the boundaries of the body were porous, where the self extended into the community through the water itself. The Victorian showerer who scrubbed his body with soap and hot water was not just preventing disease. He was living in a world where the boundaries of the body were rigid, where the self was a fortress to be defended against the filth of others. Both of them were right and both of them were wrong, and the water did not care either way. Let me take you to a place that most of you will never see. It is a small valley in the mountains of Japan, near a village called Kinosaki. The valley has been known for its hot springs for over 1,000 years. The water that bubbles up from the earth is rich in minerals, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and it is hot, almost too hot to bear, and it smells faintly of sulfur. In the winter, when the snow covers the rooftops and the roads are treacherous, the locals walk through the streets to the public bathhouses, carrying their towels and their soap, and they soak in the open-air pools while the snow falls around them. The steam rises from the water and mixes with the falling snow, and the bathers sit in the pools in silence, their shoulders above the water, their faces turned up to the gray sky. They are not thinking about hygiene. They are not thinking about germs or humors or the history of public health. They are thinking, perhaps, about the heat and the cold and the pleasure of being suspended between the two. They are doing something that people have done in this valley for centuries, and they are doing it for reasons that are both ancient and brand new, and the water receives them exactly as it received the bathers of the Heian period, exactly as it will receive the bathers of the 22nd century, if there are any left. To me, the most moving part of this history is not the grand narrative of progress or decline. It is the small, stubborn persistence of the act itself. The bath has been forbidden and permitted, encouraged and discouraged, medicalized and moralized and commercialized. It has been blamed for plague and praised for preventing it. It has been a luxury of the rich and a necessity of the poor, a social ritual and a private indulgence. And through all of it, people have kept getting into water. They have kept lowering themselves into wooden tubs and stone pools and porcelain baths and iron cauldrons and rivers and streams and lakes and oceans. They have kept doing it even when they were told it would kill them, and they have kept doing it when they were told it would save them, and they have kept doing it for reasons that they could not articulate and that no single theory could capture. The rust motif has followed us through this entire story, and I want to let it settle now. The pipes that carried water to the baths of Rome have mostly crumbled. The iron cauldrons of the medieval stews have rusted into red dust. The lead pipes of bath have been replaced. The copper tubing of the modern bathroom will one day corrode too. The water keeps moving through the pipes, and the pipes keep failing, and the people keep bathing, and the cycle continues. There is no triumph in this story, no final victory of cleanliness over dirt, no moment when the human relationship with water is finally resolved. There is only the water itself, pouring through the centuries, carrying everything with it, the humors and the germs, the shame and the pleasure, the theories and the doubts, and emptying at last into the sea where it all began. I will leave you with a room. It is a bathroom, any bathroom in any city in the present moment. The light is dim. The water is running. A person is about to step into the bath. She does not know the history of the act she is about to perform. She does not know about the medieval stews or the Roman aqueducts or the Victorian pamphlets or the Japanese hot springs. She only knows that she is tired and that the water is warm and that for the next 20 minutes she will float in a world that belongs only to her. The water will receive her as it has received every bather since the beginning of the species. And the water will remember nothing because water does not remember. It only flows and waits and accepts whatever body comes next. If you would like to visit another time, another room, another bath, The water is ready.